Today, we bring you a timeless story, a tale of unexpected love and quiet transformation. This is the story of a little girl, sick and abandoned, who found her way into the hearts of two people who had long forgotten how to feel. Let us begin this touching journey of hope, change, and the silent magic of kindness. So let's start this heartwarming story. Idleness, vice, and intemperance had done their miserable work, and the dead mother lay cold and still amid her wretched children. She had fallen upon the threshold of her own door in a drunken fit and died in the presence of her frightened little ones. Death touches the spring of our common humanity. This woman had been despised, scoffed at, and angrily denounced by nearly every man, woman, and child in the village. But now, as the fact of her death was passed from lip to lip, a subdued tone of pity took the place of anger and sorrow of denunciation. Neighbors went hastily to the old, downheard hut in which she had secured little more than a place of shelter from the summer heat and brought some with grave clothes for a decent interment of the body, and some with food for the half-starving children, 3 in number. Of these, John, the eldest, a boy of 12, was a stout lad, able to earn a living with any farmer. Kate, between 10 and 11, was a bright, active girl of whom something clever might be made if put in good hands. But poor little Maggie, the youngest, was hopelessly diseased. 2 years before, a fall from a window had injured her spine, and she had not been able to leave her bed since, except when lifted in the arms of her mother. What is to be done with the children, was the chief question now. The dead mother would go underground and be forever beyond all care or concern of the villagers, but the children must not be left to starve. After considering the matter and talking it over with his wife, Farmer Jones said he would take John and do well by him now that his mother was out of the way. And Mrs. Ellis, who had been looking out for a bounty girl, concluded that it would be charitable in her to make choice of Katy, even though she was too young to be of much use for several years. "I could do much better, I know," said Mrs. Ellis, "but no one seems inclined to take her. I must act from a sense of duty. Expect to have trouble with the child, for she's an undisciplined thing, used to having her own way." But no one said, "I'll take Maggie." Pitying glances were cast on her worn and wasted form, and thoughts were trampled on her account. Mothers brought cast-off garments and, removing her soiled and ragged clothes, dressed her in clean attire. The sad eyes and patient face of the little one touched many hearts, and even knocked on them for entrance, but no one opened to take her in. Who wanted a bedridden child? "Send her to the poorhouse," said a rough man when the question, "What's to be done with Maggie?" was asked. "Nobody's going to be bothered with her." "The poorhouse is a sad place for a sick and helpless child, as hard for your child or mine," said another lightly speaking. "But for this brat, it will prove a blessing change. She will be kept clean, have healthy food, and be doctored, which is more than can be said of her past condition." There was reason in the head, but still, it didn't satisfy the heart. The day following the day of death was made the day of burial. A few neighbors were at the miserable hovel, but none followed the dead cart as it bore the unhonored remains to its pauper grave. Farmer Jones, after the coffin was taken up, placed John in his wagon and drove away, satisfied that he had done his part. Mrs. Ellis spoke to Kate with a hurried air, barely saying, "Your sister, goodbye," and drew the tearful children apart ere scarcely their lips had touched in a sobbing farewell. Hastily others went out, some glancing at Maggie, some resolutely refraining from a look, until all had gone. She was alone. Just beyond the threshold, Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, paused and said to the blacksmith's wife, who was hastening off with the rest. "It's a cruel thing, Julia. Where's she to go?" "To the poorhouse." "She'll have to go there," answered the blacksmith's wife, hurrying away and leaving Joe behind. For a little while the man stood with a puzzled air. Then he turned back and went into the hovel again. Maggie, with painful effort and at the risk of falling, had raised herself to an upright position and was sitting on the bed, straining her eyes toward the door out of which all had just departed. A vague terror had come into her thin white face. "Oh, Mr. Thompson," she cried out, catching her suspended breath. "Don't leave me here all alone." Though rough in exterior, Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, had a kind heart, and it was very tender in some places. He liked children and was pleased to have them come into his shop, where sledges and wagons were made or mended for the village lads, often without a draft on their hoarded sixpences. "No, dear," he answered in a kind voice, "go to the bed." And stooping down over the child, he added, "You shan't be left here alone." Then he wrapped her with the gentleness almost of a woman in the clean bedclothes that some neighbor had brought. And lifting her in his strong arms, bore her out into the air and across the field that lay between the hovel and his home. Now, Joe Thompson's wife, who happened to be childless, was not a woman of soft temper nor much given to self-denial for the good of others. And Joe had well-grounded doubts touching the manner of greeting he should receive upon his arrival. Mrs. Thompson saw him approaching from the window and, with ruffled feathers, met him a few paces from the door. As he opened the garden gate and came in, he bore a precious burden, and he felt it to be so as his arms held the sick child to his breast. A sphere of tenderness went out from her and penetrated his feelings. A bond had already formed itself around them both, and love was springing to life. "What have you there?" sharply questioned Mrs. Thompson. Joe felt the child start and shrink against him. He did not reply, except by a look that was pleading and cautionary, that said, "Wait a moment for explanation, and be gentle." Then, stepping back, he shut the door and stood face to face with his vinegar-tempered wife in the passageway outside. "You haven't brought home that sick brat." Anger and astonishment were in the tones of Mrs. Joe Thompson. Her face was in a flame. "I think women's hearts are sometimes very hard," said Thompson. Usually, Joe quietly got out of his wife's way or kept rigidly silent and non-combative when she fired up on any subject. He was, therefore, somewhat surprised to find that she now encountered a friendly, steadfast countenance and a resolute pair of eyes. Women's hearts are not half so hard as men's. Joe saw, by quick intuition, that his resolute bearing had impressed his wife, and he entered quickly, and with real indignation. Be that as it may, every eye at the funeral turned steadily away from the sick child's face. And when the cart went off with her dead mother, all hurried away and left her alone in that old hut, with the sun not yet an hour in the sky. Where are John and Kate?" asked Mrs. Thompson. Farmer Jones tossed John into his wagon and drove off. Katie went home with Mrs. Ellis. But nobody would take the poor, sick one. "Send her to the poorhouse," was the cry. "Oh, why didn't you let her go then? What did you bring her here for?" "She can't walk to the poorhouse," said Joe. "Somebody's arms must carry her, and mine are strong enough for the task." "Then why didn't you keep on? Why did you stop here?" demanded the wife. Because I'm not up to going on fool's errands. The guardians must first be seen, a permit obtained. There was no gainsaying this. When will you see the guardians? Was asked with irrepressible impatience. Tomorrow. Why put it off till tomorrow? Why not go at once for the permit, and get the whole thing off your hands tonight? Jane, said the wheelwright with an impressiveness of tone that greatly subdued his wife. I read in the Bible sometimes, and find much said about little children, how the Savior rebuked the disciples who would not receive them. How he took them up in his arms and blessed them. And how he said that whosoever gave them even a cup of cold water should not go unrewarded. Now, it is a small thing for us to keep this poor, motherless little one for a single night, to be kind to her for a single night, to make her life comfortable for a single night. The voice of the strong, rough man shook, and he turned his head away so that the moisture in his eyes might not be seen. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but a soft feeling crept into her heart. Look at her kindly, Jane. Speak to her kindly, said Joe. Think of her dead mother, and the loneliness, the pain, the sorrow that must be on all her coming life. The softness of his heart gave unwonted eloquence to his lips. Mrs. Thompson did not reply, but presently turned toward the little chamber where her husband had deposited Maggie. And, pushing open the door, went quietly in. Joe did not follow. He saw that her state had changed and felt that it would be best to leave her alone with the child. So he went to his shop, which stood near the house, and worked until the dusky evening released him from labor. A light shining through the little chamber window was the first object that attracted Joe's attention as he turned toward his house. It was a good omen. The path led him by this window, and, with opposite, he could not help pausing to look in. It was now dark enough outside to screen him from observation. Maggie lay a little raised on the pillow, with the light shining full on her face. Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the bed talking to the child, but her back was toward the window, so that her countenance could not be seen. From Maggie's face, therefore, Joe read the character of their interaction. He saw that her eyes were intently fixed upon his wife, that now and then a few words came, as if in answer, from her lips, that her expression was sad and tender. But he saw nothing of bitterness or pain. A deep-drawn breath was followed by one of relief, as if a weight had lifted itself from his heart. On entering, Joe did not go immediately to the little chamber. His habit drew him toward the kitchen. He had not been there long before his wife came out from the room where she had been with Maggie. Joe thought it best not to refer to the child, nor to manifest any concern in regard to her. How soon will supper be ready? He asked. Right soon, answered Mrs. Thompson, beginning to bustle about. There was no asperity in her voice. After washing the dust and soil of labor from his hands and face, Joe left the kitchen and went to the little bedroom. A pair of large, bright eyes looked up at him from the snowy bed, tenderly, gratefully, pleadingly. How his heart swelled in his bosom. With what a quicker motion came its beating. Joe sat down, and now, for the first time, examining the thin face carefully under the lamplight, saw that it was an attractive face, full of childish sweetness which suffering had not been able to obliterate. Your name is Maggie, he said as he sat down and took her soft little hand in his. Yes, sir. Her voice struck a chord, it flowed like a low strain of music. Have you been sick long? Yes, sir. What a sweet patience was in her tone. Has a doctor been to see you? He used to come, but not lately. No, sir. Have you any pain? Sometimes, but not now. When had you pain? This morning. My side ached, and my back hurt when you carried me. It hurt you to be lifted or moved about. Yes, sir. Your side doesn't ache now. No, sir. Does it take a great deal? Yes, sir. But it hasn't ached any since I've been on the soft bed. Ah, soft bed feels good. Oh yes, sir, so good. What a satisfaction mingled with gratitude was in her voice. Supper is ready, said Mrs. Thompson, looking into the room a little while afterward. Joe glanced from his wife's face to that of Maggie. She unday. There was an effort at indifference on the part of Mrs. Thompson. But her husband had seen her through the window and understood that the coolness was assumed. Joe waited, after sitting down at the table, for his wife to introduce the subject uppermost in both their thoughts. But she kept silent, and so did he, for many minutes. He maintained a like reserve. At last, she said abruptly, "What are you going to do with that child?" "I thought you understood me, that she was to go to the poorhouse," replied Joe, as if surprised by the question. Mrs. Thompson looked rather strangely at him for a moment and then dropped her eyes. The subject was not again referred to during the meal. After it was over, Mrs. Thompson toasted a slice of bread, softened it with milk and butter, and added to this a cup of tea. She took them in to Maggie and held the small tray on which she had placed them, while the hungry child ate with every sign of pleasure. "She is as good as she can be," said Mrs. Thompson, seeing with what a keen relish the food was taken. The child paused, with the cup in her hand, and answered with a look that awakened to new life old human feelings, which had been slumbering in her heart for half a score of years. "We'll keep her a day or two longer. She is so weak and helpless," said Mrs. Joe Thompson, in answer to her husband's remark at breakfast time the next morning. "But you must step down and see the guardians of the poor about her." "Oh, she'll be so much in the way," said Joe. "I'll just keep her for a day or two, poor thing." Joe did not see the guardians of the poor that day, or the next, or the day following. In fact, he never saw them at all on Maggie's account. For in less than a week, Mrs. Joe Thompson would have sooner thought of taking up her own abode in the almshouse than of sending Maggie there. What light and blessing did that sick and helpless child bring to the home of Joe Thompson? The poor little waif, it had been dark and cold and miserable there for a long time. Just because his wife had nothing to love and care for outside of herself. And so she had become sour, irritable, ill-tempered, and self-afflicting in the desolation of her woman's nature. Now, the sweetness of that sick child, looking ever to her in love, patience, and gratitude, was as honey to her soul. And she carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. As for Joe Thompson, there was not a man in all the neighborhood who drank daily of a more precious wine of life than he. An angel had come into his house, disguised as a sick, helpless, and miserable child, and filled all its dreary chambers with the sunshine of love. And that was our story for today, the tale of a little girl who brought light into a lifeless home. Sometimes, a child's presence becomes the very miracle we didn't know we needed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Stay kind, and keep spreading love.